Next up, habitat restoration. Campbell has graciously agreed. Campbell is the executive director of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy and is here to talk about the restoration network, something that most of the agencies around the table are involved in. And leading up to agenda item 5A, Chuck, this is a really important item to cover. No. I'm going to use that in support of this process.
You're going to get a 5A t-shirt.
Yeah, there's time.
Well, good morning. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm very excited about the first meeting of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. One of the ways the Conservancy has been One of the ways the Conservancy has been successful early on has been bringing groups together that are working on issues in the Delta to allow them to get a better understanding of what every agency is doing and what their shared objectives are. And I see this effort as really extending that up to the highest levels. And when the world looks like the back of our placemat here, it's groups like this that are going to be really, really critical in how we actually implement and achieve what we need to achieve. So I want to talk a little bit about one of our efforts along those lines, and that's the Delta Restoration Network. I think most of you know that our role is to be a lead agency for ecosystem restoration in the Delta, but also to promote and support efforts that protect the environment and the economic well-being of all Delta interests. As I mentioned earlier, our role really is to coordinate and integrate efforts that are going on in the Delta. And as such, we thought that restoration, well over a year ago, we started to contemplate what would a Delta restoration network look like and why do we need one. And our first step was to go out and work with all of the agencies to better understand what their concerns are relative to restoration. And there was a consistent concern that what we need is really Herculean efforts in coordination and integration if we're going to achieve restoration at our current levels and at future scale as well. I do want to mention that you've got a 2-page overview of the concepts that I'll be talking about in the packet. Hopefully you've had a chance to check that out. When we think about restoration, I want to make sure that everybody knows that the magnitude of the current effort. We do have the 8,000 acres for the biological opinions under the Fish Restoration Program Agreement. We have the Environmental Restoration Program under the Department of Fish and Wildlife continuing. The Sassoon Marsh Plan has recently come to completion and will start to do restoration. And of course, we have the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, all envisioning a great deal of restoration currently. And then, of course, we have the expectation of the Delta Plan and the restoration associated there. And if BDCP comes to fruition, it's off the chart. The scale of the endeavor is enormous and would likely result in at least 4 agencies and several NGO partners and upwards of $4 billion in the system doing restoration over a 40-year period. So that does really speak to the need for extreme levels of coordination and integration. If we're going to do, as Director Bonham suggested, ensure that we do restoration at the right place, at the right time, and with landowner engagement. So with those concerns in mind, we brought together the Restoration Network, and we've had good participation. It's a voluntary effort, but we've had about 14 agencies participating, several NGOs, several of the consultant organizations that are doing restoration design and projects in the Delta now, and local Delta interests. We know we need to get more Delta interest at the table, but it's challenging for them to engage on this issue currently, but it likely will, we will continue to seek their input. It's important to recognize, too, that this is not necessarily a Delta Conservancy endeavor. This is an effort to bring people together in the space and time to be able to have these conversations. One of the first things that the Restoration Network did was developed a framework, an overarching document that just provides the basics. It's an 8-page overview of how we intend to achieve this coordination and integration at scale over time, and how we're going to ensure that we have, this is always the long line of adjectives here, but a landscape scale restoration focused on processes that support resilience of native species, adaptively managed, science-based, effective, transparent, and accountable over the next 40 years. We start with a problem statement. I believe I had a slide for the problem statement. Is that loaded up?
The statement is the problem.
Do you have that already? Because I've got it on thumb drive. Sorry. Should have done that beforehand. The framework, so you'll see the problem statement here in a minute, and ultimately what it gets to is the complexity of the issues and the magnitude of the challenge that we face in restoration. There are two key concepts in the framework currently, and the first is the regional conservation strategies. The regional conservation strategies are recognized in the Delta Science Plan as the ways that we will do restoration planning, how we will determine the right place, right location, and the right time to do restoration. They're essentially learning and decision support systems that allow us to hold the complexity of the ecosystem with the agricultural system and the flood protection system. So being able to look at the ecosystem, the physical characteristics, all the biology, the agricultural system, the drainage patterns, the high-value crops, the infrastructure, the communities themselves, and then the flood protection system, and be able to look at all of those collectively as we decide and determine where we move forward in restoration. These are living documents. They don't result in an end product, but they almost result more in a space where we have the ability to create alternative visions of the future in the Delta. The strategies are intended to provide the rapid restoration design and alternative analysis to meet the regulatory requirements, but also the modeling and interdisciplinary assessments that are going to be required to maximize the ecosystem benefits and minimize the impacts to the community in general. There we go. I won't read through that problem statement, but I think if you take a look at it, you can see it's really getting to the heart.
Size is the problem.
Yeah, that's it's included in the packet as well. So regional conservation strategies really start with a dynamic inventory, as I mentioned earlier, where we collect the complexity, all the data, the models, the systems, everything we know about the system. It then moves into an assessment of the best available science relative to the restoration, and then gets to a feasibility assessment system that facilitates broad stakeholder and policy input that, again, allows us to envision alternate futures for restoration in the Delta. We envision that this all happens in what we're calling a restoration hub. The restoration hub is the place where we have the time and the space, and we bring folks together, but we also have the tools that will facilitate our development of these regional conservation strategies. Some of the tools that we're talking about here are big data platforms. We've heard a lot about big data platforms and the need for them in the system, but it also creates the workflow that's critically important. It's the ability to leverage all the tools and data that we have in the system, bring them together in a way that they're easily accessible and used. So if you think about the DRERIP models, CalSim, DSM2, EcoAtlas, the Delta Ecological Flows tool, we have the ability now to bring those together and utilize them in new ways, very collaboratively, to make much better decisions. But it brings those tools together in a platform that makes them much easier to use, but also with the experts and the staff from all the folks, or all the agencies represented around the room. One of the ways we like to think about it is if you think about your cell phone is a very powerful tool that guides your everyday life, and it brings together all these little data sets. We have that capability in many other sectors around the world today, and it's revolutionized the way we make decisions. We need to make sure that we have that technology and that capability in our water and resource management in California, particularly here in the Delta. Just three key concepts that I want to make sure that everybody takes home today. This sounds complex. It is, but it is absolutely necessary if we're going to achieve restoration at scale in the Delta. And it ultimately should result in cost and time savings. There are projects in the Delta today that have moved forward in the absence of good process and the ability to provide good science, and it's resulted in delays in those projects, as well as significant cost for designing and then redesigning, and then ultimately significant cost reduction in overall project when the designs have been informed by good science. So cost and time saving is really a mantra for the effort that we're trying to put together. The second key concept is that ultimately it must be viewed by the regulatory agencies, Dan and Maria and others, as the way that we provide the best available analysis and transparent vetting of the best available data and models, so that ultimately they recognize that they wouldn't want to issue permits with anything less. It gives them the confidence to be able to say that we have looked at the best available information and we're moving forward. And it ultimately should reduce litigation in projects in the future. The last key concept is that it must be concurrent. We recognize, again, this is a big effort. It cannot stop projects that are moving forward. Projects have to move forward. We have to make progress. We have to look at the models and systems we have in place and build on them over time to build this out. There's no expectation here that we will somehow stop and plan for a couple years to get restoration right before we move forward. The last thing I want to mention is really our next steps, what we're trying to do. We would very much like to stand up a pilot hub for the Delta in the next 6 to 12 months. There's a small design group of the Restoration Network working to really refine and define what it is this hub will do, how many people it is, what they'll do on a daily basis over the course of a year or more, how they will focus on completion of a first regional conservation strategy and defining costs associated with that. And then we will be going around to service providers as well as foundations for bridge funding and, of course, agencies trying to identify funding for getting this process up and running. I do want to mention, once again, that this is an area of statewide interest. This is an opportunity to incorporate this approach and this technology into California water and resource management. The Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan is another NCCP. We're working with them, thinking about how these technologies fit in both. Director Bonham will actually have to sign both of those documents, so there's an interest in making sure that the technology and the capability is there. We're also working with the San Francisco Estuary Institute to think about how this would help the Baylands system as well. So it's an exciting time. We're very interested in moving this forward, and we think that it'll be really critical to our success in restoration over time in the Delta. And welcome any questions. Thank you.
Campbell, thanks for that overview of the very important process. I know as I met with each of your agencies, restoration was a common link to the activities that all of you have. Any comments or response? Jared?